Yeah. Okay. Well, here we are back again, and we are moving right along here with British Literature 2, and we are now well into the 20th century, and this is actually our second to last class. So we really are now moving towards the final turn, as it were, and getting ready for our sprint to the finish. And so tonight we're going to be taking up Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway at considerable length and talking about that as yet another experiment in the literary movement that we have been pursuing for the last few weeks, known as modernism. And Virginia Woolf is one of the most important of the high modernists, as we often call them now. That is to say, during the period of the most intense work by modernist writers and artists and producing some of the classics of what we now call high modernism, mainly of the 1920s through about the 1950s or thereabouts. So, Virginia Woolf, let's just go to the PowerPoint briefly here. Thank you. Virginia Woolf produced Mrs. Dalloway in 1925, and you'll remember that a number of other things were being produced in the early to middle 1920s. Some of which we've already been looking at here. T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land. We talked at least briefly about Joyce's Ulysses at the end of our last class, and we used that as an example of some of the kinds of experiments that were taking place, both with form and with content, in modern fiction. And one of the things, of course, that Joyce is so well known for is that in something like Ulysses, though not only in Ulysses, we have the narrative of one day broken into 18 separate episodes, and each one of those episodes is from a formal point of view, an experiment with a different form or a different set of forms in which to tell a story. We looked at one of those, the Laestrygonian section, last time, which is in your anthology, and we saw Leopold Bloom, who is the central character of Ulysses, around lunchtime going into a pub because he feels the need to have something to eat. But he is so repulsed by the way in which the men are not only slopping beer around so that the place smells of stale beer, but also they're gobbling their food just like animals, that he eventually leaves. Well, how is that represented for us? Well, remember how it was represented. Partly through a stream of associations, and partly through what would seem to be, just utterances, or even just sounds, not even utterances in our usual grammatical sense of the term. So, that was a very, very famous experimental work, and around the same time, actually just slightly after that, out came Mrs. Dalloway, in which also we have Virginia Woolf writing a very experimental novel. This is experimental particularly in its form and its formal structures of narration, that is to say, how to tell a story, but also it's going to be experimental in certain respects in terms of its content. There are things in this novel that one just didn't find in novels of the period, unless, of course, they were experimental in the same sense that Woolf's is. But hers is one of the very finest of these modernist classics. We're going to be talking about the experiments with content as we go along here, which include multiple, sometimes controversial perspectives on such traditional themes as cultural identity, individual identity, and sexual identity. And in terms of cultural identity, you will notice that there is a lot of criticism in the novel of Britain and Britishism and of British jingoism, nationalism, the pride that the British took in themselves, which often is held up for a certain amount of, if not scorn, at least laughter by characters in the novel. Especially notice Peter Walsh, and we'll get into that a little bit more as we go along. The people whom he says are the finest representatives of what Britain could produce, people like Hugh Whitbread or Richard Dalloway, are really empty-headed and shallow, very shallow people from Peter's point of view. Now, does Woolf really agree with them? It's hard to tell. That is to say, with him, with his point of view. It's hard to tell. But there's nothing in the novel that would suggest that she disagrees with some of the observations that he makes, the wry, ironic, and even satirical or even sarcastic observations that he makes about the British upper middle class and upper class. So we have that. And we have the whole question of what Clarissa is really doing with her life. I mean, is this really admirable, or is it just another example of a kind of shallowness? Well, that's something, of course, that she worries about some of the time, but also Peter Walsh brings up again and again and again. So that has to do with individual identity. Who are these people? What kind of a person is Clarissa Dalloway? What do we know about her, and how do we know what we know about her? In part, we know things about her because we are privileged to go into her consciousness and have directly represented the processes of her consciousness as she's thinking about herself, about her relationships with her husband, about her relationship with her very dear friend Peter Walsh, who had been in love with her, and possibly she had been in love with him, at least for a while, sometime earlier on in her life. And now, of course, he's going to reappear. But we also get a good deal about her from Peter Walsh. Not simply what he says when the two of them interact with one another, as they do, for example, in the living room or later on in the party, but also because we are allowed to go into his consciousness for long stretches in the novel, and much of what he is reflecting on is he's reflecting on her. Not only his relationship with her, he's never gotten over being in love with her, by the way, and he feels rejected by her when she decided to marry Richard Dalloway. But he also is reflecting on her character, how she has developed since she was a teenager and now is a woman in what we politely call her middle years. She's 52. Turns out that he's 53. And so they're no longer kids, but they're also not really old either. But they're at a point at which they can take stock of their lives. What have they accomplished in their lives? And what can they be expected to accomplish beyond this point in their lives? It's not that life is over at 52 by any means. It's just that it becomes a point at which these characters are reflecting on what they have and have not accomplished thus far. So, and also, of course, those around them. You know, Richard Dalloway, Hugh Whitbread, Sally Seton is a very interesting character, and we're going to come back to her in just a moment. So we have a lot of that exploration of not only cultural identity, but also of individual identity, and to a much greater degree in the way this is done than had been done in a lot of other fiction. And then, of course, we have questions of sexual identity, which are very, very interesting. You know, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to have accomplished things that a man is expected to have accomplished in his life according to the conventions of the time? You know, what makes a man a success? What makes a man a failure? These are questions that come up in terms of not only the gendering of male and female, but the conventional expectations within their society for what a man should do, what a woman should do. Okay, but then we also have the question of sexual identity in the more explicit sense of sexual identity, when we have the relationship developing between Clarissa and Sally early on. This is when they were teenagers. And it's very clear that they had an erotic relationship. And so Clarissa, even now at 52, is looking back on that relationship that they had when they were 18 and was thinking about how frequently, at least in her experience, how frequently young girls who were on the verge of becoming young women would have crushes on one another, and how there was a very strong erotic element in that. Well, these are things that people didn't talk about. You know, they didn't talk about these out loud, and they certainly didn't talk about them in novels or represent feelings or experiences like that in novels. And notice that Clarissa, you know, simply takes that for granted. She just says, well, you know, that's how I felt about her, and that's how she felt about me, and, you know, that's just the way it was. Okay, without making any kind of judgment one way or another. And, you know, that too would have been extremely unusual in literature that was intended for a wide public audience in 1925. Now, it is true that in the 1920s, and I believe that I've mentioned this here before, but it's a good idea perhaps to remind ourselves of it, that in the 1920s, Sigmund Freud published his 3 essays on sexuality, in which he had talked about how repressive Western societies were toward sex, and how sexual repression was often the source of all kinds of psychological problems, especially neuroses. And so what Freud seems to be preferring, even suggesting, whether he intended this or not, this is the way he was taken by his contemporaries, was his contemporaries believed that therefore what he was suggesting was that we should be unrepressed in our expression of sexuality. And so you had people like the philosopher Bertrand Russell going out and giving public lectures, even out in Hyde Park, with the woman who at that time was one of his wives, talking about how we should all engage in free love, you know, that this was the way in which we were going to become really healthy and fulfilled human beings. Well, okay, I mean, that sounds, you know, sort of odd, you know, coming from what one might assume to be, you know, stuffy old professor types and philosophers and writers and intellectuals and so forth. But nonetheless, that was the kind of thing that, at least in certain circles, was in the air. And if you look at the Americans who were expatriates in Paris, you know, writing about the same kinds of things themselves, you know, without going off into that this is not really a course in American literature. Those of you who have studied 20th century American literature can fill in the blanks easily enough. You know, when you start thinking about writers like Fitzgerald and Hemingway and Henry Miller and so forth. Okay, so we have questions of identity coming up in a number of ways: cultural, individual, and yes, even sexual identity. We have other kinds of experiments with form. We have a way of constructing the everyday, and notice what I put up here on the screen is the everyday with a capital E. What on earth does that mean? Constructing the everyday. The way I usually think about this, in order to provide a relatively simple explanation, is the kind of thing that the great German dramatist Bertolt Brecht came up with. Probably at least some of you have heard of Brecht. He's one of the greatest and most innovative of experimental playwrights and directors, dramatists of the 20th century. What Brecht said was that it's not simply self-evident what is ordinary, what is everyday. Let's say that you were going to put on a play, and you were going to stage this play as dealing with the lives of very ordinary middle-class people. What kind of setting would you use? What kind of costuming would you use? Well, let's just say that you made your stage setting look like a more or less typical middle-class, urban or possibly suburban living room, okay? And then you had your characters dressing, more or less like middle-class men and women would, in ordinary life, living in, relatively comfortable but not rich, nonetheless relatively comfortable middle-class or upper middle-class contexts. Notice in the choice of the furnishings, what you would actually be doing is constructing a sense of the everyday. You would be constructing a sense of the everyday, wouldn't you? You could construct something very different, couldn't you, if you wanted to? Something that was very futuristic, that would give a sense of like something out of science fiction, looking into deep space and people living in deep space. You could do that too, where you could construct something like the Starship Enterprise and the furnishings in the Enterprise as being very, very different from the kinds of things that we would experience in the homes that you and I are accustomed to, right? Or you could construct something that would look like, say, aristocratic households of the 19th century with all kinds of very ornate and fancy furnishings that would have been popular, at least among the people who had the money to purchase them at that time, right? In other words, the very setting in which you put your actors is itself going to be a construction. And if what you want it to look like is everyday life, then you will have to construct that. It's not just there, okay? Now, the same thing is true with a novel. Why do you suppose that many novelists spend a lot of time establishing the setting in which they place their characters, okay? And the kinds of clothes that they're wearing or other things that are physically associated with them. Notice that this means that there is a kind of code of the everyday, a kind of code of the everyday, okay? So that a novelist like Virginia Woolf, and we're going to see some examples in just a moment, is really constructing a sense of everyday life in London in the 1920s by drawing upon a kind of code of what people expected to see when they experienced what they believed to be everyday life. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, you'll notice that I have here then the terms largely through metonyms and synecdoches. Good God. You know, has he totally lost it? What are these terms? Well, these terms come originally from Greek, and these are terms that we use in discussions of poetry and poetics. A metonym is some kind of an association, usually a physical association, though it doesn't have to be a physical association, but some kind of an association. And let me give you a very simple example of what I'm talking about. Let's just say that that I had been wearing this jacket all semester long. As I recall, I don't think I've been wearing it all semester long. But let's just say that I've been wearing this jacket all semester long. And then one day you came to class, and I was not here, but you saw my jacket draped over a chair, right? The jacket itself would have become sufficiently associated with me that the jacket itself would invoke a sense of my presence, let's say. Okay? So, and maybe even the kind of person that I am in your eyes. Okay? An even better example would be that I had a really, really ugly green jacket at one point. I mean, I can't tell you how beat up and ugly this green jacket was. And I loved it. It was wonderful and comfortable and so forth. I just lived in it for a long time. And let's say that you saw that ugly green jacket, you know, draped over a chair in the eating area in the university center. You might then think, he's here, right? Because the jacket, in some sense, would have come to stand for me, and maybe even for some things about me. Okay? So that's more or less what a metonym is, and I'm going to be getting into some of those in just a moment. And a synecdoche, does anybody know what a synecdoche is? I mean, anybody here? Yeah, what's a synecdoche?
It's when a part of something represents the whole.
Exactly. When a part of something represents the whole. Like in Dickens, when the workers are reduced to being the hands, right? Okay, the hands. Obviously, the workers work with their hands, but notice they have been reduced simply to the functions that they perform with their hands. And from the point of view of the owners and managers, they're not real live three-dimensional living people with feelings and problems and hopes and joys and sorrows and all the things that other real human beings have. But they're simply the hands. Okay? The same kind of thing can happen when, say, in a literary work, we describe somebody by describing their eyes. Or maybe something about, you know, their physical appearance, right? You can't possibly describe everything about a person, can you? I mean, if I were to ask you to perform this exercise of getting out a piece of paper and writing down a physical description of somebody in this room, could be me, could be another student in the room, okay? What would you fix on? You would have to fix on certain details because you couldn't possibly describe everything, could you? Not in words. Not in words. So you might pick on somebody's hair, right? And then the person's hair, in a certain sense, would come to stand for the person. Or you might pick on, or not pick on in the sense of, pick on, but you might select Something else about the person's physical appearance. The person's nose or ears or mouth or eyes or whatever it might be. Okay? Well, that's what happens in literature. I've sometimes done this exercise in classes where I've said, okay, open your book to page such and such. Now, tell me what this person looks like. And then I'd get up at the board and I would draw in whatever the person said for me to draw in. And it's a very interesting exercise. Try it for yourselves sometime. Okay? So you've got like a smile floating in the air, right? And maybe some hands clasped, and maybe some buckled shoes, and that's it. That's it, right? The part standing for the whole, okay? Now, let's talk a little bit more about these two things. Metonyms. I've already mentioned clothes. To a certain extent, if you have interest at all in your clothes, and if you have, the wherewithal, I'm talking about monetary wherewithal, to make some choices about what you buy and what you wear, notice what you're doing is you're choosing metonyms for yourself, aren't you? To some extent, and again, I'm presupposing the freedom to make certain kinds of choices about clothes. But to some extent, what we do when we choose clothes for ourselves is we are choosing something that will project what we want to project about ourselves to others. That may be very casual, it may be very formal, it may be very stylish, it may be deliberately unstylish. I mean, it could be lots of different things. Somebody is very reserved, somebody is very outgoing, right? And we tend to interpret people's clothes in that way to some extent, at least. To some extent, okay? Once again, assuming that you have the freedom to make choices, don't you surround yourself, in your apartment or your home with things that in some sense reflect you and your personality, or at least what you perceive to be you and your personality, and perhaps would like to project to others about yourself, right? If you put a picture on the wall or hang up a poster or something like that, that presumably says something about you, doesn't it? After all, you're the one who made the choice to put that picture up on the wall. If you have the freedom to choose the kinds of furniture you have, or the kind of automobile you buy, right? Cars are perfect examples of what I'm talking about. We often assume that, once again, I'm presupposing that you have a certain freedom, including monetary freedom, to choose the kind of car that you want to choose, and maybe the color of car that you want to choose. And notice that this becomes expressive of you and of your personality, to a certain extent, at any rate. Okay, now, what does this mean in terms of a writer? Well, notice what Virginia Woolf does here. She spends a lot of time talking about people's dress, right? Not only what women are wearing, but also what men are wearing. Talks about all kinds of things physically associated with them. Car, notice at the beginning, we assume that this must be some very important person who is in this limousine with the drawn curtains. Why? Because of the nature of the car, right? It projects a sense of wealth, power, symbolically, right? So who must be riding by in such a car? With a chauffeur, by the way. And not only with a chauffeur, but a chauffeur who is able to call over a police officer, show the police officer a card, and the police officer clears the traffic away. Right? This must be a very important person indeed. And so the people along the sidewalk and in the shops who are watching this car go by assume that it's the Prince of Wales, or perhaps the Prime Minister, or maybe the Queen, right? Now, we never know who it is, but notice that the car by itself comes to stand for importance, and importance of a certain kind. And notice that this is not flamboyant. This isn't a red car, or an orange car, or chartreuse car. This is a very sedate, conservative car. Okay, but it just breathes wealth and position and power and importance. Well, okay. So, notice Peter at different times in the novel, especially when he gets nervous. What does he do? He takes out his knife, right? And he plays with his knife. Oh, what is that all about? I mean, what does that tell us about Peter? Why is that in there? Why is it constantly referred to? Why does he feel comfortable when he can fish out his knife? Why do other people, such as Clarissa and Sally, take note of the fact that he fishes out his knife when he does? Okay? I mean, those things are not in there just by accident. Virginia Woolf is much, much, much too careful a writer just to sort of toss things in. So we ask then, well, what does that mean? What is that about? You'll notice the people who are observed in the first section when you have that movement down the streets of London, that there are people on the omnibuses. I mentioned last time that omnibus is the original word from which we derive the word bus in America. The word omnibus is a Latin word which means for all or for everyone. It was the transportation for everybody, okay? Not just private cars and private carriages, but this is what's for everybody. So on the top of the omnibus or bus, there is a raised part. I don't know if you've seen any of these. Occasionally you see these in sightseeing tours in the United States, but they're very common in England, where they'll have a bus more or less like our buses, and then they'll have a top level, and you can go up the stairs and you can sit on the top level if the weather is nice. And the people are up there with their parasols. Parasols? What does that stand for? Well, notice that already that signifies something, doesn't it? About what kind of people they are. And they are referred to as people of the English middle classes. What happens when we have Hugh Whitbread described wearing this impeccable gentleman's outfit when he goes to Lady Bruton's for lunch, for example? Or we have the way in which he is described in terms of his clothing when he serves in his minor office in court. Now, the court here, of course, is not a legal court. This is the court of the king and queen. And he has some minor official position there. And he's described in this very dandy-like outfit, which to Peter, who is giving the description at that point, to Peter Walsh, makes Hugh look absolutely absurd. But nonetheless, that's what he is, okay? Notice when in the party later on, We have Sally showing up at the party unexpectedly, and Clarissa has not seen her in apparently over 30 years, not since they were 18 together, and now they're in their early 50s. And so how is Sally described? I mean, it's not simply that she's older, as everybody would be, 34 years later, but notice how she's dressed. And notice with whom she is associated. She is married a man who is a businessman in Manchester. Now, Manchester is not, or at least certainly in 1925, was not regarded as one of the places where the aristocracy hung out. Manchester was a manufacturing town and very much a kind of working class city. And in many ways, that's still its identity. Well, okay, so what do we have here then? This is a whole kind of identity for Sally, right? Beyond that, she's got 5 kids, 5 grown sons, right? These two are associated with her, as I've said, metonymically, so that, notice, that tells us something about her. And Clarissa is shocked. We might just sort of shrug our shoulders and say, oh, well, she got married, and she married this guy from Manchester who has apparently a fair amount of money, and she's had a bunch of kids, so what's unusual about that? What's unusual about that is that it shocks Clarissa. It's not just what has happened to Sally, it's what Clarissa's response is to Sally at that point. Okay? We have lots and lots and lots of other things like that. We have, we're going to get into talking about Septimus in just a moment, but notice that Septimus, the guy who's been in the war, right, and is the veteran, who was what we used to call shell-shocked in the war. Now we call it a post-traumatic disorder. And his best friend, Evans, was blown to bits before his eyes. And now notice he has moments where he hallucinates and he sees Evans, or he hears Evans' voice, and various other things like this, right? We're going to look at that in just a little bit, the kinds of things that are going on in his mind and how he is treated or maltreated by the 2 physicians in the novel, which is very interesting, by the way. So what about Septimus? We learn things about how he's dressed, by the way. We first meet him in the park, and he's sitting there in the park, and to some extent we get inside his consciousness and inside his personality, but much of what we learn about Septimus is through his wife, right? Lucrezia, known simply in England as Ricia. She's an Italian young woman, and he married her when he was in Italy in the war. The war, of course, here is World War I, because the period of time that we're talking about, we can tell, by the way, from various references, but in particular, when Peter Walsh talks about how long he has been away from England. He was gone for 5 years, from 1818 to 1923, and he has just returned. So the action of the novel must be taking place in or about 1923. Okay? And so here is this young man with his young wife who is obviously very, very, very seriously ill and very, very psychologically disturbed as a result of his experiences in the war. And his wife really doesn't know what to do with this, right? I mean, she has very limited resources. She's not even English. She's living in this foreign country. She speaks the English language well enough, it would appear, but it's certainly not her first language. She very much misses her family back in Italy, and she misses working with them together in the hat making business that they had back in Italy. And we find out a little bit farther along that Septimus had come along, in his military uniform and seemed very gallant and very good looking and even dashing, and he swept her off her feet, as it were. And so they married. But then all of a sudden, she had to go to England. And not only that, but now she is living with this husband whom she believes doesn't really even know her a good deal of the time because of, his psychological disturbances, and certainly no longer loves her. And yet she doesn't seem to consider divorce or even separation as a serious option. She still wants to have a child, and of course she wants to have the child with him. He thinks that it's horrifying, the whole notion of having a child. He's even horrified by the notion of sex, right? Comes up with that whole business about Shakespeare, Antony and Cleopatra, and so forth. We'll get into that also by and by. And he's come up with his own theory about Shakespeare, that Shakespeare really hated sex, and that's what Antony and Cleopatra and other Shakespearean plays are really about. Well, again, we take this all to be symptomatic of how deeply, deeply disturbed Septimus is. But once again, much of what we learn about Septimus, we learn through her, don't we? Partly through him and representations of his consciousness, but partly through her and the way in which she serves as a kind of reflector. Now, by reflector, I'm using that term in the sense that Henry James did. Henry James, the American novelist who, by the way, crossed over the sea and became a British subject, just as T.S. Eliot did. I guess you know that. I'm not sure that I actually mentioned it in class, but T.S. Eliot, whom we were studying before, also was an American born in St. Louis, educated here in the United States, but then he went over to England, and he eventually became a British subject also. So, anyway, Henry James at one point was given the opportunity to come out with a new edition of his novels. This is towards the end of his life and career. And so he produced what is famously known as the New York edition of his novels. And one of the things he had an opportunity to do was to write prefaces to his novels and talk about what he was trying to do in his novels. And we can take those prefaces, which now have been separately published, by the way. I mean, you can buy a book which is just the prefaces of Henry James. And what you have is a very interesting series of reflections by a writer, a major writer, on what he was doing in his writing. What his different strategies and techniques and so forth were in his writing. And one of the things he talks about is how sometimes characters can function as what he calls reflectors. Reflectors. You know what a reflection is, of course. You know how you can see your reflection in a mirror. Okay? Or how about to be seen as others see you? In other words, as reflected in their eyes. Okay? That's what happens often enough in this novel. I'm talking now, once again, about Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. Sometimes characters function as reflectors, that is to say, so that we can see things about Septimus through the eyes or in the eyes of Rhesia that we would not otherwise see if we simply saw a representation of what he thinks and thinks about himself. The same thing is true with Peter Walsh. We see things about Clarissa that we would not otherwise see as she is reflected in him, in his eyes. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so that can be one of the functions that certain characters can play. Now, that doesn't mean that the characters can't also be, as in these two cases of Rhesia and Peter Walsh, cannot also be important characters in their own right. Okay? So, we're talking now about some of her experiments with the form of the novel. Okay? So, notice the second thing, if we can go back to the screen just a moment, that I had put on that screen was that we have streams of associative, and now we know what metonyms are, but associative movement from one thing becoming associated with another thing, becoming associated with another thing, becoming associated with another thing, rather than traditional Aristotelian plotting, in which you have one episode following another episode following another episode following another episode, and those episodes all being causally connected to one another. But notice, as I said in our last class when we were talking about Joyce and that passage that I was reading out to you from Joyce, that that's not the way our minds work most of the time. Let me just back up, and I know I'm going to be repeating myself, but I think it's important to repeat this point here. If we are concentrating on some kind of a problem that has to be dealt with in a very clear, systematic, step-by-step way, such as working on an algebra problem, then we can focus our mind and discipline our mind to work in a clear, logical, step-by-step manner. But that's not the way our minds work most of the time. And if you're simply out on a fine summer day, as the characters at the beginning of the novel are, and you're sitting on a park bench and you're just letting your mind wander, what happens? You can simply be going along by a process of association. One thing leads to another thing, leads to another association, and so forth. Okay? I mean, it's even possible, unlikely as that might seem, it's even possible that there are some people who are not listening to what I'm saying right now, but are actually letting their minds wander from one thing to another. You know, maybe something I said, about London brought up in your mind's eye the image of one of those red buses that they have in London. Even if you haven't been to London, you've probably seen pictures of them in movies, which could become associated with somebody you know who's English, which could remind you of a friend you know through that person whom you know who is English, and so on and so on. See how your mind could just go by one association to another, to another, to another, until you are, as the common expression goes, a million miles away. Right? Well, that's much of what we have here. And yet there is a structure to the novel, and what is one of the principal devices for giving structure to time in the novel? Not just to space, but to time. Anybody know? The striking of the bell at Big Ben. You know what Big Ben is? What's Big Ben? Yeah, it's right. It's a tall tower with a clock at Westminster Abbey. Okay, or right by Westminster Abbey. And so, and the House of Parliament, by the way, also. And so you can hear that, and the chiming of the clock as it tells time throughout the central part of London. And you, at different times as you're going along in the novel, have Big Ben chiming. And it will even be registered in the mind of one of the characters. Oh, it's 12 o'clock. Or, oh, it's 3 o'clock. Okay? But it isn't always registered that way. Sometimes we simply hear the chiming of Big Ben. Okay? Which, of course, is a fixture in London. So time is structured throughout the novel. The whole novel takes place in one day. From morning, and it's not even that early in the morning, but from morning until the evening of that one day. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't flashbacks, so that there are times when Clarissa in particular, but also Peter Walsh, will be going back in time to the place where they used to spend their summers during vacations when they were teenagers. And the kinds of escapades they indulged in, and the sort of crazy stuff that happened, like Sally at one point going to take a bath and realizing she's forgotten her towel, and so she runs back down the hallway naked to get her towel, and the maid, who's apparently very straight-laced, gets very huffy about this and says, oh, what if any of the gentlemen had been about? So, but that's just sort of one of those things that shows us, what Sally is like, or at least what she used to be like. You see, very impulsive, very unpredictable, very much her own person, okay, not following conventions. So, and even a kind of marginal person. So we have then this dealing with time in the sense that we go from the present to past time, most often for Clarissa and Peter, back to that time when they were in their later teens. But also sometimes to more recent events in the past, such as Clarissa thinking about certain times with her husband, or stuff that her daughter has done which she does not approve of, as we find out as we go along. And then, of course, Peter thinking about being back in India, and remember that he is now engaged to a woman back there. And, unfortunately for him, she's married, and she's got 2 children. Well, apparently he's been carrying on some kind of a love affair. I mean, it's never really explained to us in great detail, but if he's engaged to be married to a woman who's already married to somebody else, that certainly implies very strongly that they have some kind of very intimate relationship going on. The other thing is that you'll notice how people talk about him, like at Lady Bruton's when she has the lunch. And Hugh and Richard are talking about poor Peter, and, you know, he might have had a brilliant career, but there's a flaw in his character. What we finally find out, they see to be the flaw in his character, is that he's gotten himself into difficulties with women. But notice that's never pursued. What are we talking about? Difficulties with women. Well, there are only these implications, because these people think of themselves as too polite and too civilized and too upper class, really, to deal in that kind of scandalous rumor. And yet, of course, they will allude to that sort of thing, even though they will still maintain the illusion of not indulging in scandal. Okay, so much of the novel then is very, very fluid, and this is characteristic of many of her novels. A couple of us were talking before class about some of her other works, and I was mentioning To the Lighthouse. And To the Lighthouse, likewise, you have long stretches of the novel taking place in a kind of stream of consciousness form. With the waves, you have an even more radically experimental novel in terms of the formal structure of the novel itself, and so on. One of the most conventionally developed novels, at least in terms of its narrative structure, that Woolf ever wrote was the one which was most popular, and it's called The Years. It's received the least amount of critical attention from literary scholars and critics, perhaps, but it was most popular among her novels in her own lifetime. But in any event, what she is best known for, therefore, is this kind of experimentalism. Okay, so let's go one more time to there we are, to the PowerPoint. So, streams of consciousness in which character development becomes plot. It's not simply that it serves the plot. It's not simply that characters are developed within the plot. It's actually the reverse of that. The mode of developing character becomes the form in which the novel is plotted in long stretches of the novel. Okay, so are there any questions about what I've been saying here? Okay. Okay, don't forget to press your button there.
Is she a complete pioneer of that concept? Or were others experimenting with the same type of...
Certainly other people were experimenting with these things. Is she a pioneer? Yes, certainly she's a pioneer. Are there other people who are experimenting with stream of consciousness or different ways of representing consciousness? Well, Joyce, and when she wrote about Joyce, which she did, she wrote a lot of literary criticism. And she wrote a lot of criticism of English authors, both past and, to her, present. And when she talked about Joyce, she talked about some of the amazing experiments that he did in his novels. So these people all knew one another and or knew one another's work. I've mentioned this before. The world was smaller then. I don't mean just in the obvious global sense of being smaller, that there were fewer people on the planet. But of the people who were engaged in literature and the arts and philosophy and science and so on, that was a much smaller group of people back in the 1920s than it is today. Okay? And so people did tend to know, they either knew one another personally or they knew of one another and of one another's work. So that's a very good question, though. And yes, she is a pioneer. So, okay, well, let's just look at the early part of this novel. And I'm just going to begin at the beginning. And if you've read the novel, you will know exactly what I'm referring to. And don't worry if I'm not giving you page references all the time, because it happens that the publisher of this novel has now come out with the novel in a new format. So the pagination is not the same for everybody. So, but what I'm talking about now are major things in the novel. And if you're familiar with the novel, you're not going to have any trouble following it. Or if you're not yet familiar with the novel, though no doubt you very shortly will be, what you can do is just follow me. Just pay attention and jot down a note or two here and there. And then when you do get a chance very closely to look at the novel, look at some of the things that I'm mentioning. Okay? So we begin the novel. We don't know what this is about, right? Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. That's the entire first paragraph. Well, what's going on here? For Lucy had her work cut out for her. We don't know who Lucy is yet, by the way. The doors would be taken off their hinges. Ruppelmeyer's men were coming. Then, thought Clarissa Dalloway, what a morning, fresh as if issued to children on a beach. In other words, beautiful. Beautiful morning, right? So Lucy sounds like she's some kind of a servant in the household, right? But we don't yet really know that, but there certainly is an implication of that. What a lark, what a plunge. For so it had always seemed to her, when, with a little squeak of the hinges, which she could hear now, she had burst open the French windows and plunged at Burton into the open air. We're going to find out, by the way, in a few minutes, that Burton is the place in the country where years ago they used to go on vacation in the summertime. How fresh, how calm, stiller than this, of course. Oh, okay, so this is another place, another time. The air was in the early morning, like the flap of a wave, the kiss of a wave, chill and sharp, and yet, for a girl of 18, as she then was, she's no longer 18. We don't know how old she is, but we already know that at some other time, associated with water, by the way, which of course is going to turn out to be true. Remember, they go out boating on the lake, where she also experienced the freshness of morning in the summertime when she was 18. And yet solemn, feeling as she did, standing there at the open window, that something awful was about to happen. Looking at the flowers, at the trees, with the smoke winding off them, and the rooks rising, falling, standing, and looking, until Peter Walsh said, Peter Walsh? Peter Walsh? What happened? We've just been sliding into something else, haven't we? Until Peter Walsh said, musing among the vegetables. Was that it? I prefer men to cauliflowers. Was that it? He must have said it at breakfast one morning when she had gone out onto the terrace. Peter Walsh. He would be back in India one of these days, June or July, she forgot which, for his letters were awfully dull. Okay, see how we've been sliding back and forth here? And just getting our bearings is going to take us a minute or two. You might even turn back to the preceding page, and say, well, wait a minute now, okay, what just happened? Clarissa Dalloway. Clarissa Harlow is the main character in another famous English novel. Clarissa Dalloway, and then Peter Walsh musing, and then Clarissa, or is it Clarissa thinking about Peter Walsh? Okay. But Peter Walsh is going to become a major character a little further along. It was his sayings one remembered, his eyes, his pocket knife, his smile, his grumpiness. And when millions of things had utterly vanished, how strange it was, a few sayings like this about cabbages. See, much of what's going on in this novel is that it's about memory. How do we remember? I don't mean how mechanically do we remember, but how do we remember what we remember? And why do we remember what we remember? And in what form do we remember what we remember? And to what extent do we reconstruct things, reimagine things, re-experience things in memory? Notice that in some sense you are your memory, aren't you? Your identity in very large part is your memory and what you remember and what you don't remember. An easy way of putting that to the test is I used to work in hospitals. I think I've mentioned that before. In my checkered career, with my many occupations in the past, I used to work in hospitals. And one of the things that you would find in working with patients who, as a result of some traumatic injury or perhaps as a result of having a stroke, would lose certain mental capacities. And they might lose the power of speech, but they might also lose certain parts of their memory. Or some people who experience things like, say, Alzheimer's disease. And I'm not talking about just being a little forgetful, the way all of us can be a little bit forgetful, but people who truly are losing their memories. And over a period of time, they are losing their memories, but they're still aware of what is happening to them. And there's a sense of not knowing who they are, right? Because you are, in a very important sense, your memory. And we've seen that come up over and over again in this course, haven't we? Think about Wordsworth. Tintern Abbey, in part, is about memory, isn't it? And about the power of memory, and about the forms of memory, as is Wordsworth's Prelude. Think of Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. That, in many ways, is about memory, not only, in that case, individual, but also cultural memory. And so on during the course. We have talked about that. Well, so also here. She stiffened a little on the curb, waiting for Dirtnell's van to pass. A charming woman, Scrope Purvis thought her, knowing her as one does know people who live next door to one in Westminster, a part of London. A touch of the bird about her, of the jay, blue-green, light, vivacious, though she was over 50, and grown very white since her illness. There she perched, never seeing him, waiting to cross, very upright. We're already beginning to get some physical description of her, but also some insights into her personality. For having lived in Westminster, in this fashionable part, how many years now? Over 20. Over 20. One feels even in the midst of the traffic or waking at night, Clarissa was positive, a particular hush or solemnity, an indescribable pause, a suspense. But that might be her heart, affected, they said, by influenza. Before Big Ben strikes, there, out it boomed. First, a warning, musical, then the hour, irrevocable. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. Okay? Here we are, Big Ben, the first time. We're going to hear Big Ben over and over again throughout the novel. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. Such fools we are, she thought, crossing Victoria Street. For heaven only knows why one loves it so, how one sees it so, making it up, building it round one, tumbling it, creating it every moment afresh. But the veriest frumps, the most dejected of miseries, sitting on doorsteps, drink their downfall, do the same, can be dealt with, she felt positive, by acts of Parliament for that very reason. They love life. In people's eyes, in the swing, tramp, and trudge, in the bellow and the uproar, the carriages, motor cars, omnibuses, vans, sandwichmen shuffling and swinging, brass bands, barrel organs, in the triumph and the jingle and the strange high singing of some airplane overhead was what she loved. Life, London, this moment of June. So we know it's June, and notice the hustle and bustle of the big city. Now, this happens to be London, but it could be set in another city, right? You just have to change the names of some of the references here. Okay, and she loves it. She loves the liveliness of big city life. And notice all of those items. We've had one after another, after another, after another. Those taken, not individually but collectively, stand for London. Stand for London. You can actually have in your mind's eye a kind of picture, can't you, of a bustling big city. For it was the middle of June. The war was over. Notice we're getting here, as we go along, certain markers of time, both time past and time present. We know in time past, going back in memory to when she was 18 at Burton, Peter Walsh, we'll learn more about that later, but notice we're already getting the seeds sown for what will grow in the novel. And here, she's over 50. We don't know quite how old yet. We later find out she's 52. She lives in a fashionable part of town, has done so for a number of years. She's out buying flowers. Why would she be out buying flowers? Well, the maid is fixing up the house. Okay? Something is happening. The war was over. Okay, except for someone like Mrs. Foxcroft at the embassy last night, eating her heart out because that nice boy was killed, and now the old manor house must go to a cousin, or Lady Bexborough, who opened a bazaar, they said, with the telegram in her hand, John, her favorite, killed. But it was over, thank heaven, over. It was June. References now to people who had been killed in the war, what people in those days called the Great War, and somewhat idealistically proclaimed, along with President Wilson, that this was the war to end all wars. Well, okay, that's going to become a very, very major element in the novel, isn't it? Because very soon we're going to meet in this meandering down the street in London, we're going to meet Septimus and his wife Rhesia. And Septimus is the one who has been so severely damaged by the war, and his own best friend being blown up before his eyes. But notice here, people are taking this very casually as a kind of conversational point. And notice that Clarissa has been to these affairs where these elegant people are congregated. So, it was June. The king and queen were at the palace, and everything was well, at least among that aristocratic group in England. So, notice one of the things that's going to come up is that notion of there will always be an England, except Peter Walsh knows better. And we're going to see more of that after we take a short break.